Last week, BRS TV made an excellent video called 10 Things the Reefing Hobby Should Stop Doing. And because Reef Talk is the Apple of the reefing YouTube world, I've taken that idea, made my own list, and made it better. First up is overcomplicating things, and I'm going to give two really good examples relating to nano tanks of around 40 gallons or less, which is 150 litres or less. It's really common to try to deal with high nitrates or phosphates by adding things like carbon dosing, or changing the filtration media you're using, or by buying sexy new filtration equipment. And while those ideas can work, they're not the most simple, and keeping it simple is almost always the best way. With a small tank like that, the best thing to do to reduce high nitrates and phosphates is water changes. If you're using a good quality source water, that will bring the nitrates down, and if you do several large water changes over the course of a few days, it will resolve your problem. You might even find that it's your source water that was causing the problem in the first place, so using good quality source water will fix that. And related to that, the other example is dealing with algae. Now in a nano tank it can be a little bit more difficult because you can't include fish like tangs, but again the temptation is often to try to get on top of nitrates and phosphates with various forms of filtration media, when really the best idea is to perhaps address how much you're feeding, see if you're overfeeding and putting too much in, and ultimately buy an urchin. A blue tuxedo urchin is a fantastic weapon against algae in a small tank, and they are the one critter I would recommend for algae control in absolutely every tank. The number two thing the hobby should stop doing is selling single polyp zoas. Now in the right conditions, zoas are a really fast growing coral, to the point that they are often considered a pest because they can spread and take over, particularly if you haven't isolated them on their own island. And yet they're really often sold as single polyps for quite high prices, whereas in reality it wouldn't hurt the vendor to sell 4 or 5 polyps, or maybe even double that, for just a few pounds more, and they'd still have plenty of zoas left that grow quickly enough to make that a viable business practice. The plus side of getting a single polyp zoa is that you can put it in exactly the right spot you want, and you don't have to worry about it spreading really quickly, but ultimately, because single polyp zoas are more likely to die than a larger colony, I would really like to see the hobby stop selling single polyps. The third thing I'd like to see the hobby stop doing is spending crazy money on torch corals. Corals seem to go in cycles of when they're really fashionable and really popular, and at the moment, torch corals are very much the in thing. And it's not hard to see why. You get some absolutely fantastic colours that in particular look really nice under blue lights. However, they sell for absolutely huge money. I'm talking several £100s for a single head, and it's just absolutely crazy. As long as there's still hype around torch corals and ever increasingly crazy names, people will keep buying them and will keep paying high prices. But all we need to do as hobbyists is stop paying crazy money for torches, and the prices will eventually come down. So next time you see a torch coral in your local fish shop for more than say £200 a head, just walk away and eventually the price will come down. And number 4 is importing fish that have no place in a home aquarium. Now there are two categories of this, and one category is the really finicky fish like copper-banded butterfly fish that are difficult to get feeding and as a result often die in our tanks. But really I'm talking about the second category, and that is fish like the dragon wrasse, like sweet lips and batfish that look nice and cute and small when you see them in the shop, but they get absolutely enormous when they're fully grown and really only have a place in public aquariums. And the worst part is that it's really easy for someone to buy these fish when they're nice and small in the shop with no idea that they're going to get big because you haven't done a bit of research in advance. But the importers know the true position, so if they could just stop importing these fish in the first place, no one would fall into the trap. Number 5 is a really tricky one, and that is taking information at face value. When you're watching videos just like this, it's really easy to see one little snippet of information that perhaps you're looking for and then latch onto that and think, this person has said it, they know what they're doing, and therefore it's what I should do. Now whether it's on YouTube, Facebook or forums or anywhere else, it's always difficult for the person giving the advice to explain absolutely everything they mean and give full context. So what we need to do as hobbyists is take what we hear, digest the information and work it through, work out whether it's going to apply to our own circumstances and our own tank, and that way you're much more likely to get good outcomes. A really good example of this is feeding. Now in the BRS version of this video, Vic from Worldwide Corals said that we should stop overfeeding, and yet in their tanks they feed an absolute ton of food. So it would be very easy to think, well actually hang on a second, they feed a load of food, so I should as well. But the reality is that their tanks are very different, they get an absolute ton of maintenance, they have loads of corals to uptake all those nutrients, and they have high export, which most people don't. So with that example, it might feel like a really good idea to feed heavy because that's how Worldwide Corals have success, but in reality, in a much smaller tank, you need to apply that logic and figure out whether it works and suits your particular aquarium. Number 6 is thinking that expensive equipment equals success. Now I am a bit of a hypocrite for this because I am an absolute gear junkie. In fact, I've changed my lights more times than I care to admit on my main tank. And it's really easy when you're starting out in the hobby to think you need to spend an absolute fortune on all of the equipment. A great example is power heads. Now the Vortec MP40s are absolutely fantastic and probably the best power head in the hobby in my personal opinion. But your corals will appreciate a Jecod powerhead that is a quarter of the price just as much, and the things that you get from the Vortex that you don't with the Jecods are things like ease of maintenance because you can just pop the wet side off and no cables in the tank, neither of which your corals care about. It's not that you don't get what you pay for, of course you do with everything in life, it's just that your corals aren't going to grow twice as quick if you upgrade from the Gen 5 Radions to the Gen 6. Number 7 is a big one and very important, and it is using ulva algae in your tanks. Now some people use ulva instalensis in things like algae scrubbers or as a treat for their tanks. But the danger is that you might end up with a far more invasive variety like ulva lactuta, which is spawn of Satan and really difficult to get rid of once it's in your tank. And in fact I shut down a nano tank previously in part because I had ulva that I couldn't get rid of. There are other treats that will be just as tasty for your tanks and other algae that will be just as effective in algae scrubbers, so let's just remove the risk and stop using ulva altogether. And number 8 is chasing coral growth through unconventional means. I'm talking about things like experimenting with high alkalinity, or tweaking with your lighting spectrum trying to get it perfect over several months, or even things like coral food and trace elements thrown in at random. Now it's not that none of those things work, it's just that they are the cherry on top of the icing on the cake. And the hobby is built on the basics, and it is far more important to get those right than playing with other pioneering areas such as trying to get your alkalinity up. So before you embark on that kind of journey, make sure you've got all the basics sorted, and if you've got all of the basics covered, the chances are you're going to have very good growth indeed, and if not, then you can start looking at other things. Number 9 is importing corals that we can grow easily. Now there are loads of times when I see corals like Montipora in shops that have been imported from Indonesia, for example. Now Monties are absolutely common as muck, they're everywhere in the hobby and they grow really quickly. In fact, they grow so quickly that many people throw away excess growth because they can't even sell it themselves. So the fact that we still import these corals from the wild, where they're less likely to be as hardy, is just completely beyond me. And it applies to other corals as well, things like trumpet coral that's a really fast growing LPS and we have plenty of in captivity, and things like Duncan as well, where the same rationale applies. At some point in the future there will come a time when we can't import any corals anymore, so let's remove corals that we don't need to import and get ahead of the game. And number 10 is avoiding water changes. I talked earlier about the basics of the hobby, and one of which is that doing 10% weekly water changes just works. It's a really effective way of maintaining salinity, of reducing nitrates, and of replenishing things like trace elements that otherwise you won't be able to replenish. There is no doubt that water changes can be a bit of a faff, lugging water around your house, mixing water up for hours on end, and potentially sloshing salt water over your carpet. And there will of course be some people who do have success without doing water changes, but they are very much the exception to the rule, and it's the one thing that you can do that is really easy and will increase your chances of success in the hobby. So those are my top 10 things that I think we as a hobby should stop doing, but let me know what yours are in the comment section below, and if you enjoyed the video, give me a thumbs up and subscribe for next week, and until next time, happy reefing.